Thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and thanks for being here today on a day where you could be in many other places, so it's so great to be here with you as we talk about everyone's favorite topic, the plague. The city of Milan was in lockdown, at least for those less fortunate residents who had no choice but to remain in their homes. The shadow of death was in the air as disease had returned to the northern Italian city. The new normal was the cancellation of Carnival and a Lent in which no one could attend the celebration of Holy Mass or other processions. The hospitals were full. The public authorities were less than thrilled when the Cardinal Archbishop attempted to enter the hospital and provide viaticum to the dying. And yet there the Archbishop of Milan stood, offering the Blessed Sacrament, risking his very life that women and men might have their sins forgiven and receive the body and blood of Christ before they died. And many would. During this outbreak, nearly 6,000 citizens of Milan died in 2 months. Over 17,000 citizens of Milan would die over the course of the year. Of course, by now you probably know that I'm not talking about the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 and 2021 and likely 2022. I'm speaking about the 1576 outbreak of bubonic plague in Milan. Although we've all heard of the Black Death, which is technically used for the period of 1347 to 1351, bubonic plague was a persistent threat to Europe and Asia for over 400 years. So when you get a little bit tired of COVID regulations, just add another 398 years. Today, dear friends, our task is to contemplate the saints that arose during this 400-year period. We do so not as an object of historical interest, but as an invitation to think anew about sanctity today. The talk will unfold in 5 parts. First, I'll say something about the bubonic plague, or what we call the Black Death. Second, I'll attend to the response of the church to the plague. Third, we'll look at 3 intercessor saints, including Saint Sebastian, Saint Michael the Archangel, and the Blessed Virgin Mary. Fourth, we'll turn to the saints who came about in time of plague, including Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, as well as Saints Charles Borromeo and Aloysius Gonzaga. Fifth, we'll turn to some contemporary reflections very briefly at the end. Let's begin. Like many, I was first introduced to the Black Death through Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Bring out your dead! 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 Conference. Bring out your dead!
This dark comedic moment captured the true disease caused by the bubonic plague. In fact, Monty Python, little known fact, one of the cast members of Monty Python had his doctoral degree in medieval studies. So it's probably the most accurate reflection of medieval life that you could imagine. So this dark moment captures really what was happening during Europe. It was not only the terror of illness, of death, that caused such fear. Rather, Black Death was an occasion of total abandonment, likely by church and family alike. Normal practices of dying, ubiquitous in late medieval Europe, were replaced by getting rid of bodies. For most, there would be no viaticum, no last confession of sins, no Eucharistic liturgy praying for the dead, no procession from the home to the church and then to the grave. There was death, and death alone. Oh. What is bubonic plague and why was it so dreadful? The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, is caused by fleas. Our forebears did not know this. Before the plague, doctors, a rather loose category, presumed that the disease was caused by an imbalance of humors in the body. Things like blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The imbalance of humors would result in sickness, hence the practice of bleeding. Before we mock our forebears for this theory, let us remember that they understood something about sickness we don't. Sickness and therefore healing is a holistic affair. Humors could be placed out of balance because of the quality of air, because of sadness, because of a lack of festivity in one's life, or too much festivity in one's life. This theory of humors, even if incorrect, ironically led to the only way to treat the plague, cito longe tarde. Leave quickly, stay away for a long time, come back slowly. This advice worked in the end because it enabled at least the well-to-do to escape from the bacteria that caused Black Death. Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis was passed on from fleas that fed initially upon the blood of rats. When the rats died, the fleas found new hosts, either more rats or, when there were no more rats, human beings. Late medieval Europe's population was growing rapidly and they needed a new supply of food. Grain arriving from the east, ships bringing in goods across land and sea, reintroduced the plague into Europe in a swirling wave pattern that devastated every European country for 400 years. Although it's difficult to know exact death rates, plague killed off at least somewhere between 25% and 50% of Europe's total population in 5 years. John Aberth has recently estimated that England's towns lost 60% of its population between 1347 and 1500. To give a scope for these numbers, in the United States today, COVID has killed roughly 0.2% of the US population, or around 680,000 people. To have a similar impact as the Black Death, COVID-19 would have needed to kill between 25 to 60% of the US population. That is between 82 and 197 million people. New York, Chicago, Houston, add up the top cities in the United States, and it would still need to kill more than that to reach the bare minimum numbers. Like other diseases, dying from the plague was and is miserable. After the flea bite, the infected person would have between a day and a week before symptoms appeared. The flea-bitten person would have a black mark on his leg, experience fever, headaches, nausea, and unquenchable thirst. The lymph nodes would swell near the bite, giving the disease its name, bubo, or bubonic plague. These swollen nodes swelled, burned, felt like thousands of needles were pricking one's skin. The likely dying person produced a virulent smell out of every one of his orifices. The last physiological stage of the plague was systematic organ failure. In his book, Epidemics in Society, From the Black Death to the Present, when we all shut down for COVID, I did what all academics do. I bought a book on epidemics. In this book, Snowden writes, by producing degeneration of the tissues of the heart, liver, spleen, kidneys, lungs, and central nervous system, the systemic infection initiates multiple organ failure. At this point, patients have wild bloodshot eyes, black tongues, and pale, wasted faces with poor coordination of the facial muscles. They experience general prostration, teeth chattering chills, respiratory distress, and a high fever that normally hovers in the range of 103 to 105, though it could go as high as 108. In addition, there is progressive neurological damage manifested by slurred speech, tremors in the limbs, a staggering gait, and psychic disturbances ending in delirium, coma, and death. Pregnant women who are especially vulnerable invariably miscarry and hemorrhage to death. Sometimes there's also gangrene of the extremities. This necrosis of the nose, fingers, and toes is one probable source of the terms Black Death. Imagine living over 400 years of afraid of the plague, of a disease in which few recovered. And among those who did recover, not a few would be infected again. There was no such thing as herd immunity. Like other diseases, the plague was, of course, not only physiological, it had economic, psychological, political, and social dimensions too. Plagues were followed immediately by famines. There were no workers to harvest the land, and supply chains shut down. Does this sound familiar? In the case of the Black Death itself, an entire feudal system came crashing to a halt, while economic prosperity followed due to the decrease in demographics. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Well, the poor were dead. Psychologically, plague was an occasion of either religious ascetic fervor or an Epicurean delight in music, dancing, and drink. Think about liquor stores during COVID. Political distrust followed plague, especially early on, as leaders fled their cities and states for personal protection. Concurrently, the state began to take on more public health measures, including sanitation, and in Italy, the opening of lazarettos, or hospitals. The social unrest caused by pandemic was especially virulent. Someone had to be blamed for the plague. And in towns, it was presumed the stranger was responsible. And in that case, if that was the case, the stranger was the Jewish brother or sister and the mendicant. In Germany, a theory developed that Black Death was too virulent to be explained by humors, so it was caused by Jewish poisoners who placed some potion in a well, infecting the whole population. Jewish persecutions arose in Barcelona, Bern, Basel, Frankfurt, and Cologne over the course of 2 years. Thousands of Jews were killed in cities as pogroms spread throughout Germany. Poor Christians, vagabonds, and mendicants were also accused of working with Jewish Germans to poison wells. Any stranger was suspect to be avoided because he either had the plague or he would poison the town well. Thus, like any pandemic, Black Death was not just about sickness of a person. It was a social, cultural illness that affected every dimension of society, and that included the church. Second part. To understand the church's reaction to Black Death, something must be understood about lay medieval religious practice. A prominent narrative is that lay men and women in the medieval period were mostly spectators of a clerical cult of professional religious. This narrative is untrue, the result of Reformation-era polemics rather than careful historical inquiry. While reception of the Blessed Sacrament was indeed rare, late medieval society was suffused with a liturgical or sacramental culture. The individual stories of men and women were shaped by the rites of the church, especially the feasts and fasts of the liturgy, and the presence of the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. The feasts of the year were civic occasions, as Augustine Thompson has shown in his Cities of God, the religion of the Italian communes, 1125 through 1325. Titles of academic books always must be that specific. He writes, feast had a social as well as a religious role. Cities fixed their court sessions according to the liturgical calendar. Padua and Mantua courts scheduled recess from Christmas to Epiphany, and during the week of Michaelmas, this week. In the spring, courts closed from Palm to Low Sunday, the time of Holy Week and Easter week. The Eucharist, as other medievalists have shown, was not only an encounter with Jesus Christ, but a renewal of the social bonds of the community. Kissing the pox board at Mass united Christians together in worship. Seeing Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, what was known as ocular communion, was itself an occasion of union with Jesus. Medieval sight was akin to the sense of touch, and therefore to gaze upon the host was to touch our Lord. The ubiquity of liturgical practice also surrounded death. The Blessed Sacrament was carried with candles to the bedside of the sick. Men and women were encouraged to follow along, praying outside the house. Death itself was a public and therefore liturgical affair. Jesus Christ and the church were present throughout the lives of men and women, especially in times of dying when loved ones were carried home together to God. During the plagues, all of this disappeared. Liturgical feasts were not practiced. Public processions ceased. The dead, even if buried, at least in an orderly manner, were not accompanied home to God. What happened for the most part was abandonment. Now, that is not to say that every clergy member left his post abandoning the city. It's clear, based on death rates, that many clergy died in the plague itself. The new mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, were especially affected. But the entire liturgical sacramental system of the church during the plague was questioned. Who could hear the confessions and bring viaticum to the dying if there were no priests around? And more importantly, why were there no priests around? Who could hear the confessions? Worse, if the local priest fled the city for the sake of his own protection, what did that mean? Who would pray for the dying, especially if at least some family members abandon their parents or children at the moment of death? Remember, cito, tarde, longe. Get out quickly, stay for a long time, do not come back. We know at least some ire during this time arose. In fact, it was directed towards the church. New lay movements came into existence, including the flagellants, which you see in this image here. A pilgrim group of penitents, the flagellants, roamed from town to town. In Monty Python, they're featured by the people who hit their heads with boards. Thousands in numbered and engaged in public penance. A master who was not a member of the clergy would whip penitents while they cried out in lamentation for the sins of the church and the world. Flagellants, although not always beloved by city or church, were greeted with enthusiasm by the faithful. With the challenge brought about to sacramental confession, with so many dead, what were people to do? Third part, intercession in the church. Flight, while perhaps native to human beings in danger, ran contrary to the sacramental presence of the church. Church authorities were critical of the flight instinct, urging men and women to stay close to home, to care for their families at the moment of death. Sacramental practice developed too, including ways of anointing the sick with very long sticks. Concurrently, while grateful for modern sanitation practices at the time, including quarantines, which of course arose during this time because it was assumed that 40 days of cleaning a ship would get rid of the odors that cause plague. It worked because it actually got rid of the fleas. But in the midst of this, the church wanted to uphold another source of healing, the intercession of the saints. Saintly intercession was ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. Part of this devotion to the saints was a clear patronage system whereby whole cities were protected by saints, made flesh literally in relics in the city. To us, and you get this if you visit the Basilica of the Sacred Heart's reliquary as it currently exists, it functions akin really to a museum of curiosities. My dad isn't Catholic. When he came to Notre Dame, he's always like, I want to go to Notre Dame and see the bodies. A bit of St. Peter, a bit of St. Paul. How fascinating. But this was not the approach to saints of our medieval forebears. Especially in high medieval society, the saint was made present through the reliquary and the various arts depicting the saints in the Eucharistic liturgy. The bodily sculpture, the painting of the saint, was that saint's presence, enabling us to see in the bone fragment or even human head more than the senses could perceive. Reliquaries often allowed physical contact with the saint. In the medieval period, you would climb into the reliquary to get as close as you could. They had holes so you could touch the saint. Altar pieces near the saints functioned akin to Byzantine icons. We're not only looking at pedagogical pictures, but the very presence of saintly men and women manifested through paint. During the plague, the church called men and women to renewed devotion to the saints. Because of the patronage system, we may be tempted to view this simply as an occasion of superstition or magical thinking, a bit of tit for tat. I pray to you, you save me. But this only partially captures what's happening. Saintly intercession recognizes that we possess a communion, as my colleague Leonard DiLorenzo has written, that surpasses death. In times when the church was experiencing profound discommunion, the saints offered the possibility for a salvific communion that could make sense of so much death, sorrow. Saints were intercessors, but they were also those who enlightened the imagination of those suffering the plague, enabling them to see Christian hope in occasions of sorrow. The saints were the presence of hope. Almost any plague saint, and there were thousands because every local city had their own plague saint, could assist us here. But I want to focus on three universal patrons of the plague: St. Michael the Archangel, St. Sebastian, and Mary, the Mother of God. First, let us turn to Michael. St. Michael the Archangel, whose feast was this very week, was the defender of the Jewish people and features prominently in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 12, Michael defeats Satan, depicted as a dragon, throwing him down from the heavens to the earth. Here's our Michael. How did St. Michael become a plague saint? During the papacy of Gregory the Great in 590, there was an outbreak of the plague. St. Gregory the Great led a procession through the streets of Rome, featuring an image of a miraculous icon, one that we saw during COVID-19 that Pope Francis included in his Eucharistic adoration. It featured the Madonna and the Child, this icon. According to the Golden Legend, a sort of narrative about the lives of the saints popular in medieval Catholicism, St. Michael appeared during the procession, putting his sword into the sheath, meaning that he had defeated the plague. We can see this very image in Rome today at Castel San Angelo, overlooking the Tiber. There it is. At least initially, the iconography may seem to us mundane. After all, it makes sense to connect the plague to Satan after what I just described, what happens to your body in the midst of the plague. Right? It's a cosmic force that represents sin and death. But let's attend more closely to St. Michael's defeating of a dragon. In late medieval society, the dragon was linked to the Eucharist itself. A series of polyphonic masses developed, later called caput masses, or head masses. These masses took the chant tone from Holy Thursday, where Peter asked Jesus to wash not only his feet, but his head, that is his caput, and then used that tone in a surprisingly celebratory mass. The musicologist Anne Walters Robertson has argued that these 14th century masses have their roots in Rogation Day processions in late medieval society. Before the Ascension, men and women would walk the bounds of their parish, asking for God's blessings. Along the way, a dragon representing Satan would be placed at the front. Over the course of the days, he was gradually put at the back of the procession, showing his defeat. During the Ascension Day Mass, the Caput Mass would be sung. And I'll play a bit of that for you. It's a very weird Mass. So, you heard the drop. It's, if you pay attention to the musical score itself, it's shaped like a dragon. And it moves you down, down, down to defeat the dragon at the end, so that the bass is like, During the consecration, at least in some English towns, the dragon was slayed at this moment of the Sanctus. This brings us back, therefore, to the images of St. Michael's defeating of the dragon. And therefore, we actually have to understand it is linked so closely to the Eucharist. Look at one of these altar pieces. This is Gerald Davis's Michael's altarpiece. Notice the dark clouds above, often used in an image depicting the plague. At the center of the altar, St. Michael slays Satan, depicted as a dragon-like figure. The consecration of the host was intended to be raised up against this image, enabling the one who gazed upon the Eucharist to see what was unfolding. In the Eucharist, St. Michael defeated the dragon anew, the chaos of sin and death that inflicted the human person. The intercession of St. Michael is closely, therefore, linked to the Eucharistic sacrifice. No matter what happens within the city, the Eucharistic liturgy continues, even if people were not able to attend. The dramatic sacrifice unfolds. St. Sebastian, like St. Michael, was not first and foremost a plague saint. An early Roman martyr of the 3rd century, St. Sebastian was initially tied to a post and shot with arrows. He did not die. Rescued by St. Irene of Rome, he later went to Diocletian, the emperor, to preach against the emperor's sins, not often the best of ideas. He was therefore naturally clubbed to death. He was known as a 3rd patron of the city of Rome, so the 3rd most important saint within Rome. St. Sebastian became a plague saint through an occasion of intercession. In 680, the city of Pavia in Italy was suffering from plague. According to Paul the deacon, angels appeared in battle with one another. A certain man in attendance was told that the plague would not subside until an altar was built in the Basilica of St. Peter in Vincoli, which is in Rome. The plague subsided at this precise moment, according to the legend, that the altar was built. Of course, this is not the only reason that St. Sebastian became a plague saint. Although an occasion of divine providence, the symbol of the plague was arrows. Why? Arrows were an image of divine wrath inflicted upon humankind. But Christians transformed this image, importantly, to understand anew what arrows meant. For example, let us look at Nicholas Regnier's Saint Sebastian attended by the holy women. Pay attention to the spot of the arrow. Its location in the side of Saint Sebastian. Further, notice the luminosity of Saint Sebastian's body. It is as white as the Eucharistic host itself. And Saint Irene attends to his suffering, right? This is, of course, out of the direct side of Christ, or the side. Sebastian has become a Christological figure, as you're starting to see, right? From the side of Christ comes forth the church. And Saint Irene is attending to him as the church ought to attend, right? So there's this image of almost Saint Irene, this image of charity arising from the side of Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian becomes a plague intercessor not only because of his patronage in 680, but because his very body becomes a consolation for those who suffered or lost someone in the plague. In his suffering, Saint Sebastian is Christ, tied up, led as a lamb to his slaughter. But his death is not the end. He is within the legends quite literally rescued from death, experiencing anew the resurrection. The body of Saint Sebastian, therefore, becomes an image of all Christians who die. Death can be configured to the sacrifice of Christ, and even in this image, configured to the very Eucharistic host. We hear this in an early motet by Guillaume Dufay, one of the first people to move from chant to polyphony. He was a Renaissance, very early Renaissance, and he set a text, a sequence for the Mass of Saint Sebastian, O Holy Sebastian. I'll play for you just a bit. Notice the dissonance in a moment. At this moment, Guillaume Dufay, the text is asking for the intercession of Saint Sebastian to come rescue them from the plague. This was perhaps sung even in local homes in Milan during the plague. People would get together and sing because one of the ways to heal from illness was to sing and experience joy in the midst of sorrow. And so there's evidence that this was passed out by Charles Borromeo, as we'll talk about in a bit, and people would just sing along. We hear in this motet by the early polyphonic composer Guillaume Dufay, his O Sancte Sebastiane, a sequence intended for Mass, invites the assembled to listen to the salvation offered by Saint Sebastian through Christ. His body protects the faithful from the plague because he has shaped his body in martyrdom into an image of Christ. The music itself, including the dissonance, invites the listener not to escape the horrors of death, but to let death itself become part of the gift, the dissonance of life transfigured through music. Once again, an altarpiece of Saint Sebastian may help us better see this. Giovanni del Biondo's Saint Sebastian triptych is a Eucharistic performance par excellence. At the center is the body of the plague saint pierced by arrows, but this is from 1375, or right sort of in, after the plague. Art was starting to change and depict Saint Sebastian. If you've ever been to Italy and wondered, they really love Saint Sebastian. Yes, because of the plague. At the center is the body of this plague saint pierced by arrows. He's configured to Christ. He almost looks like Jesus, shot with arrows on a pole akin to the cross. To the left is an image of the angel and of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Annunciation was a Eucharistic motif in late medieval art. Et verbum caro factum est, et habitat vit in nobis. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. There were masses that actually featured this secretly during the Sanctus. So at the moment of consecration, what you heard was in fact the Annunciation. The various panels depict the life of Sebastian, his intercession for the sake of the city. To celebrate the Eucharistic liturgy before this triptych, in essence, was to invoke once again the intercession of Saint Sebastian, the one who conformed himself perfectly to Christ. Like our two other saints, the Blessed Virgin Mary may not immediately be recognized as a plague saint. After all, Christians have been devoted to Mary as the Mother of God from the earliest days of the Church. And yet Marian devotion during the plague flourished. Typical argument for this is something that, they were scared of the wrath of God and therefore they turned to a mother. I think that this is problematic, as I'll show in a bit. In the late Middle Ages, art began to depict the swooning Virgin Mary. Marian imagery before the plague tended to be iconic in form. One can see an example of this if you know the work of Giotto in his depiction of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Although later discouraged, we can see in Rogier van der Weeden's The Descent from the Cross an icon of a changed relationship to Mary. Look at the Virgin Mary in bright blue. As her son was taken down from the cross, she has fainted. Her body is perfectly aligned with the body of Christ. Her hand, which actually I cut off, sorry, it's a beautiful image if you find it, actually points to a skull on the ground. Of course, there was traditional iconography had a skull on the ground. It was the place of the skulls, but it was also understood as the very site of creation too, the place of the cross. This was where creation was, and therefore the skull is a sort of restoration of creation. But in this case, it functions as a kind of memento mori, or remembering of death. The comfort of the image is that Mary suffers along with her son. One can only imagine what comfort this would have been to a world remembering the tragedy of death caused by plague. Further, the image calls the church to a deeper renewal or configuration to Christ's own suffering. Mary is, after all, the privileged image of the church. Rather than flee in the midst of the plague, the church, even if she collapses, should remain behind or beside, along the beloved Son, configuring herself to the suffering of Jesus. Mary was therefore the mother of mercy, the one who took upon herself all of human suffering alongside her Son. Because she attuned herself to the tender compassion of her Son as beloved mother, she could intervene for all those who suffered. Interestingly, the Madonna would be depicted in this image with child, an image of mercy alongside two other plague saints. This is Saint Roch, and this is Sebastian, you can tell, because once again, the arrow, right? It must be rough walking through life with an arrow through you all the time. Saint Roch, incidentally, was a plague saint who had the plague, and in all of his iconography, he awkwardly points to his upper thigh, not because he wants you to look at his upper thigh, but that's where the bobo would develop. So you can see here, an image of mercy, and you see Saint Sebastian, and you see Saint Roch. This one is by Lorenzo Lotto. The scarlet red of Mary's robe points towards Christ's suffering. His very blood. In the image of his male member, in this case his circumcised foreskin, is also a sign of this suffering. Jesus, who went under circumcision in his first days, enters into the fullness of the human condition alongside us. Increased Marian devotion during the plague was not only reserved to the swooning virgin. Rather, there was increased devotion to Mary's Immaculate Conception and her Assumption. The Immaculate Conception at the beginning of the plague was still a doctrine under examination by both the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And yet, Mattia Preti's painting of the Immaculate Conception shows the relationship between the doctrine and the plague. This is in Malta. Painted after a 1675 outbreak of the plague in Malta, Mary stands upon Satan, who is himself placed on a dragon. We have the triumph of Mary against sin and death. Mary's Immaculate Conception is good news for those suffering from, awaiting the plague. The plague is not reducible to divine wrath, but evidence that something is awry, and through the incarnation of the Son, death has met its match. We see angels sheathing their swords. a sign that the plague has been defeated. The bodies below in dark colors reach up to Mary. The location of the painting, immediately behind the altar, connects the Immaculate Conception to the Eucharist. If we are to experience a renewal of human life like Mary did, then we must come again and again to the altar to receive the Blessed Sacrament. There's also an increase in devotion to Mary's assumed body and soul into heaven in the Assumption. In Sebastian Ricci's The Assumption of the Virgin, we see a surprising connection to the plague. Commissioned after the outbreak of the plague, dedicated to St. Charles Borromeo, the image depicts the Blessed Virgin Mary assumed into heaven. The disciples are engaged in prayer, wondering what has happened. In the right corner, there's a dog next to what was initially assumed to be St. James. But importantly, St. Roch's primary symbol is that of a dog. His feast was in fact celebrated on the 16th of August, only a day after the Blessed Virgin Mary's Assumption. Of course, the Assumption as the promise of resurrection would be attractive to those who suffered from the plague. Perhaps something more, though, is at play here. Mary, after all, is the lone saint for whom there is no bodily relic. She was assumed into heaven. And the relationship to bodies in plague, often buried among other bodies, leaving behind no place for remembering the dead, would have been, well, devastating. In Mary's Assumption into heaven, we see more than a hope for a general resurrection, but a hope that our bodies, wherever they are buried, whether they're forgotten or not, will also be assumed into heaven because of the mercy of Jesus Christ and his mother, Mater Misericordia. All right, fourth part, which is much shorter, and then the fifth part, which is the shortest of all. Of course, the church also discovered in the plague new saints, those who met the challenge of their times by living out the sacrificial love of Christ. St. Catherine of Siena was born in the time of the plague. We likely know her as the second founder of the Dominicans, the woman who called the church to holiness, not afraid to speak up against the corrupt clergy, including the popes of the day. In 1374, St. Catherine experienced the plague in Siena, where she lost 3 of her siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, and an array of other relatives. Everyone left the town, as the best medical advice said, cito longe tarde. St. Catherine did not, nursing victims back to health. St. Bridget of Sweden was a Swedish nobleman who became a third-order Franciscan after the death of her husband. During the rest of her life, she would care for the sick, eventually founding a religious order dedicated to prayer and care for the poor, the Order of the Most Holy Savior, or the Brigittines. Plague struck Sweden in 1349 as St. Bridget went on pilgrimage to Rome to seek approval for her rule. She arrived in Rome just as the plague infected the city, but the Pope was not there. Like St. Catherine of Siena, she called the church back to holiness, and she called the popes to return from Avignon to Rome. Both saintly women, in their writings, implicitly inquired into the meaning of the suffering inflicted upon the plague. In her dialogue, written between 1377 and 78, Catherine dialogues with God about the meaning of suffering. Importantly, she's not presented this suffering as some occasion of wrath. Rather, she writes about the meaning of sacrifice as an occasion for deeper charity and therefore union with the beloved Christ. She writes, this is God speaking to her. You asked me for a willingness to suffer, so I've shown you all this to teach you and my other servants how you could make the sacrifice of yourselves to me. I am speaking of sacrifice both in act and in spirit, joined together as the vessel is joined with water, offers to one's Lord. You must offer me the vessel of all your actual suffering, however I may send them to you, for the place and the time and the sort of suffering are not yours to choose but mine. But this vessel of yours must be filled with loving affection and true patience with which you carry all the burden of your neighbor's guilt, even while you hate and reject the sin. The endurance of such suffering is not punishment for St. Catherine, but an occasion for sacrifice for the neighbor. To endure suffering, even the death of one's loved one, enables the extension of Christ's sacrifice into the flesh and blood world, into the life of Catherine. The church's ministers may be absent during plague, and yet in this instance, one can offer one's suffering Eucharistically. St. Bridget reflects similarly on suffering and death in her own text, based on her divine revelations. In the 5th book of her Revelations, in the 6th interrogation, she asks a number of questions linked to the plague. Why do plagues exist at all? Why does death come unexpectedly? God answers the latter question by saying, I answer, if man knew the time of his death, he would serve me out of fear and faint with sorrow. Therefore, in order that man might serve me out of charity, and that might always be solicitous about himself and secure about me, the hour of his death is uncertain, and deservedly so. For when man deserted that which was certain and true, it was necessary and right that he be afflicted with uncertainty. Bridget does not speak about the suddenness of death, therefore, as punishment or wrath. Rather, because death comes when we do not expect it, human beings have the freedom to make of their lives a sacrificial offering. They may live a life of freely bestowed charity. Contingency, including plague, are part of the fall. And rather than be bitter about this, contingency becomes an occasion for love, for vigil, for watchfulness. Both saintly women in the end provide a way for the Christian to transform suffering and death into a sacrificial offering. The task was not to run away from the plague and thereby communion. It was to run into the suffering, transforming it into a space of love. St. Charles Borromeo was a saint that took up this task. Born in 1538, St. Charles was named a cardinal before he was ordained at all. He was named a cardinal at the age of 21. By his uncle, Pope Pius IV, who called the last session of the Council of Trent and was a relatively complicated figure historically too, a member of the Medici family. St. Charles was ordained a deacon and he was called to Rome, where he was charged to enact the final session of the Council of Trent, which was continually postponed because of war and plague. St. Charles was appointed as Archbishop of Milan in 1564. The Archbishop of Milan typically did not reside in the city, instead lived in Rome. Because of this, the Milanese church was profoundly corrupt. Clerics had many children. They openly carried swords, functioning akin to feudal lords. It was bad enough that a saying developed in Milan: if you want to send someone to hell, make them a priest. St. Charles insisted upon living in Milan, where he began to enact the reforms of the Council of Trent, including the education of clergy, increased promotion of lay holiness, and held regular diocesan and provincial synods. He visited every parish in his diocese, for he knew that the vocation of the bishop was to be present. Unlike other bishops of his time, he preached, and he enacted times of 40-hour devotion to both the Eucharist and the holy relic of the nail of Christ in the cathedral at Milan. In 1576, plague came to Milan. At the time, St. Charles was outside the city, but he rushed home. During this time, he entered the Milanese lazarettos, giving viaticum and anointing the sick. He did so at great personal risk against the advisement of both public officials and his clergy. Because St. Charles knew that the Milanese needed the presence of the Lord in this time, when nearly every ward of the city was in quarantine, he placed altars in public places so that men and women could gaze outside their windows to behold the Eucharistic presence of the Lord. He assembled litanies to be sung in the home, with Italians singing out their windows to one another. Exactly what happened actually during the COVID crisis. He sold his property, giving away money to the destitute in Milan. And he held penitential processions where men and women could finally leave their home. During the procession, he wore a noose around his neck, a sign that he was a criminal, taking upon himself the suffering of the city, the condemnation of the city. During the procession, the first one, he cut his foot on a grate and walked the rest of the way with a limp, and he was bleeding. Documenting the procession, the musicologist Remy Chu writes, "Witnesses to the wound were all moved to compassion and cried out, 'Miserere, miserere, have mercy on me, have mercy on me.' The third and final procession was to be the most solemn. Borromeo bid the parochial clergy to bring out the most precious relics in order to move the masses to devotion and appeal to the saints. He carried the prized Milanese relic from the cathedra, the holy nail attached to a cross. At the close of the procession, Borromeo returned to the cathedral and began a 40-hour devotion with an hourly meditation on a mystery of the Passion. What we see in St. Charles' procession is a recognition of the need for presence. He knew that the church, if she was to be healed, needed to be in the presence of one another, of the sick and suffering, and of the saints. When the pandemic was over, St. Charles did not return to normal. He commissioned a church to be consecrated to St. Sebastian as a memory of gratitude that many in the city did not die. He composed works for laymen and women, bestowing them a series of spiritual exercises that they should perform in gratitude for the plague. If plague is to come, it should lead to deeper holiness, more frequent reflection on mortality, and thereby the contingency of our lives. Eucharistic participation should increase because frequent reception is what enables us to transform our suffering and death into a space of love. And like all the great saints, the presence of St. Charles made other saints. St. Aloysius Gonzaga received his first communion at the hands of St. Charles in 1580, 2 years after the plague. Perhaps he heard St. Charles preach a sermon like this one that he preached on Holy Thursday during the washing of the feet, an essential feast in Milan because it was so essential to Ambrose, who was from Milan. St. Charles preached, "The Creator of heaven and earth washed the feet of poor disciples, but among us, how many there are who would more readily wash their own feet with wine than extend a cup of cold water to a poor man? He showed the services of kindness to his betrayer. We deny to friends the services we owe them. Let us be affected in spirit by the indignity of such a thing. Let us be moved by such humble submission in such majesty, and let us humble ourselves with the Lord. With him, let us serve the poor. If we wish to reign with him, let us wash one another's feet. If we wish to be disciples of Christ, let us conform ourselves in life to our head, and he will deign to conform us to himself in glory. Amen." And that's what St. Aloysius did. He felt a call to missionary work with the Jesuits, and he found himself a student in Rome in 1591 during an outbreak of the plague. The Jesuits opened a hospital in Rome, caring for those who were sick. He begged for alms, seeking out the sick on the streets of Rome. He sought them out. He carried them to the hospital. When Jesuits began to be sick, they were told, "Do not go back to the hospital." St. Aloysius argued his case, and he won. His superiors let him go back. Not long after carrying a sick man back to his bed, St. Aloysius contracted the plague, dying on June 21st, 1591. A plague saint who learned to be a saint from another plague saint who learned to respond to the plague by the saints who came before. Conclusion. What about us? Our journey into the darkness of Black Death has lessons for us about the nature of sanctity, especially post-COVID. What we see again and again is that the response to plague must be a renewed commitment to presence, to the Eucharistic presence of Jesus, to the presence of Christ in the lives of the saints, presence, dear friends, to one another. Right now, we are in a space where reform and renewal is possible in the church and society alike. Returning to the old normal should not be an option, at least not for the saints. Post-COVID, we must follow the example of St. Charles, expressing gratitude through a renewed commitment to a holiness defined by presence. Our social lives right now are defined by a monstrous anti-communion otherwise. On the steps of the Capitol, on our city's streets where violence reigns, where we continue to fight over masks and vaccines, we have a crisis of communion and presence alike. Yet there's hope. COVID-19 taught us anew something that we've likely forgotten, and that likely we will not be lucky enough to go 100 years to forget again. We will not live forever. Not one of us. Masks, vaccines, none of these very good precautions will enable us to escape death. Rather than run away from this, escaping inward, fighting with one another, maybe it's time to turn to one another in love, to be present to one another in communion, to be present again to holy God and his saints. St. Charles, St. Aloysius, St. Catherine and St. Bridget, St. Sebastian, St. Michael the Archangel, and Mary, the Mother of God, the patroness of this university, pray for us. Thank you.